ننتقل إلى موضوع يطرح تساؤل حول الكيفية التي سيكون فيها اقتصاد المعرفة في مدن المستقبل. تساؤلات ستجيب عنها جلستنا الثالثة في هذه القاعة، والتي تحاور فيها الإعلامية يمنى نوفل كل من رائد صفدي وهو كبير المستشارين الاقتصاديين بدائرة التنمية الاقتصادية في دبي، والبروفيسور الدكتور بوريس تسيزلج رئيس مجلس إدارة شبكة اقتصاد المعرفة، والسيد آدم جرينفيلد وهو كاتب ومستشرق.
That is right, Sophia. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are lovers of the odd number, session number 3 is kicking off right now under the title of The Knowledge Economy in the Future Cities. So knowledge and economy. We ask all of our distinguished guests to come here and grab their seats because we invite to the stage Dr. Raed Safadi, the Chief Economic Advisor at the Dubai Department of Economic Development, DED, and Professor Dr. Boris Cizelj, President of Knowledge Economy Network, and last but not least, urbanist and author, Mr. Adam Greenfield, and all will be moderated by Youmna Noufal, producer and host of Y Chats, will be the moderator for this session. Please welcome all of them. With an applause, perhaps.
I think, you know, these sessions right before lunch, everybody's kind of...
Yeah, we know what we're
It's better than after
with.
lunch, believe me.
Hello and welcome to our session, Knowledge Economy in Future Cities. My name is Youmna Noufal. I'm here from Beirut. And I want to introduce a little bit this session. Technology, as you all know, is sweeping our world at an alarming pace. The arrival of the fourth industrial revolution means the arrival of advancements in robotics, virtual reality, cloud technology, AI, and that is just to name a few. So what are the elements of production in a knowledge economy? How does it translate in future cities, and how does it translate into a creative economy? And how can we prep the next generation to meet what is ahead? So in this rapidly changing world, knowledge is currency. I read somewhere that knowledge differs from other resources because it doesn't stop. It opens doors to more discoveries, and the interconnected world that we live in, it is by utilizing knowledge for prosperity that we build a future able to adapt and progress. So with us today to provide some perspective are 3 experts in their fields. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Boris, a professor in international economic relations, founder and director of the Research Center on Developing Countries, and founder and chairman of the Knowledge Economy Network. Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Adam Greenfield, all the way to my left, is a writer and world-renowned urbanist, leading smart cities, septic, and passionate advocate for the human-centered design of technological systems. He is one of the world's foremost thinkers on urban environments. Welcome, Adam. And Dr. Raed Safadi, last but not least, a chief economic advisor at Dubai's Department of Economic Development, where he leads a team of experts entrusted with the implementation of Dubai's Strategic Plan 2021, promoting the diversification and sustainable growth of Dubai into a knowledge-based economy.
Absolutely.
So, since we're here, I want to start with defining what a knowledge economy is. And I'm opening this to all 3 of you. Adam, do you want to take this one? How do you define what a knowledge economy is? And then I'd like to hear from Dr. Boris and Dr. Safadi.
It's interesting that you would start with me because this is not a phrase that I use in my work. I really don't think that there's any such thing as a separate knowledge economy. If you look at all of the drivers of growth in the conventional economy, even things that we think of as old-fashioned and mechanical or physical, like the extractive economy or like fabrication, production, these things these days all have knowledge folded into them. There's not a single industry that operates without some sort of intelligence being folded into it, whether it's for detection of sources, whether it's for the refinement and the optimization of processes. I really don't think there's just about any economic activity at scale operating in the world anymore that doesn't have some component of what we would think of formally as the knowledge economy. So I think it's sort of a false dichotomy, and it's just not a category that I tend to bring to bear in my own work and thought.
Dr. Boris, what is your take on this? You know, how do you define what a knowledge economy is? And then I want to bring it to the UAE with Dr. Safadi.
I would certainly agree with Mr. Greenfield that, in fact, it is a paradigm, a model There are a number of criteria according to which an economy can be recognized as knowledge-based economy. And there is probably no economy around the globe which could be called 100% knowledge economy, and there is no economy which could be said it's a non-knowledge economy. It's a process, and of course, as we are talking today of the future cities,
Yes.
cities, of course, had historically always a very important role in promoting technology, promoting know-how, promoting knowledge, science. What I would say here is just that we are nowadays very often hearing the smart city concept, which of course covers quite a lot of the ground, but not necessarily, because smart city is a city which is well managed, has a good infrastructure, certainly generates a lot and disseminates knowledge, but is not identical to knowledge city.
Yes, Dr. Safadi, and I know, I want to bring you back to Dubai, which is where we are, and the fact that when people talk about knowledge cities, they always talk about the Arab world being lagging behind compared to Scandinavian countries, for example, different countries in Europe. But you have worked extensively on the growth of Dubai and making it become a knowledge-based economy. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, let me begin first by going back to your original question.
Defining it.
Right. There is a fundamental difference between a traditional definition of, if you will, of traditional economy and a knowledge-based economy. And that resides, in definitional issues, right? When we studied economics, it is about a science, how societies actually choose to produce or to utilize their scarce resources and distribute them across the society. Two operative words in this definition are what? Scarcity and efficiency. And if you think about scarcity, think about, whether you talk about labor, capital, land, the environment.
Right.
And then you think about the new ways of thinking in terms of a knowledge-based economy. Rather than you have scarcity, the knowledge, you have abundance. Rather than, a zero-sum game, meaning a good or a service, if I use it, someone else can't use it. Knowledge is cumulative and transferable. And, it's not that if I eat 50, there's no anything called 50% of the knowledge, I eat it, and therefore I deprive some others, right? And if you have this idea, then you think about how do you create an ecosystem that promotes a knowledge-based economy. And this is what Dubai, the UAE at large also, has done, in the sense that an ecosystem that consists of incentivizing individuals, firms, organizations, to actually create a culture of innovation and knowledge and creativity, right? And then the role of government also is to lead on this.
Right, I was going to ask you, what is the role of the leadership in this?
The leadership here is to actually embed in those the values that not only just the economic values, but also as I said, the ecosystem, the regulatory framework. The regulatory framework, which is a very boring subject now. If you remember, the issue of intellectual property rights, for example, was a very sleepy thing that only lawyers knew about. All of a sudden now it's at the forefront of a regulatory system. Why? Because only through a solid intellectual property rights system that you can protect your assets, your intangible assets, which are your knowledge-based assets.
We talk about knowledge-based assets and, moving towards a knowledge economy. And I was once also told on this subject, because we always talk about the youth and how we prep the next generation to meet knowledge economies and knowledge cities. I was told you need to learn, unlearn, and then relearn. And then that's the key. Dr. Boris, do you hear me here? Do you feel me on this question?
Oh, yes. I think it's actually difficult to understand that in the 21st century, so many countries around the globe still do not manage to address the most urgent need of rescheduling, restructuring, modernizing the entire educational system. Because the skills which the kids which are now, let's say, entering universities will probably not be needed in 10 years' time when they will be at the labor market. On the other hand, there is about 30% of the jobs which we know now will not be there anymore in 10, 15 years. So especially in the post-secondary education process, the emphasis should really shift very strongly into the direction of soft skills, which means capability of working in team, a critical mind frame, and so on. While at the moment still, this is not the case with most universities around the world. So that is a big challenge, which of course in the cities where there is a greater concentration of talent and excellence, one would expect that these questions will be addressed quicker and sooner than maybe in smaller communities.
Do you want to add something to that? Just, when we talk about soft skills and where the future generations are going.
Yeah, I'd absolutely like to underline the idea that critical thinking skills and reflexivity, the ability to apply that critical thinking to one's own thought and output are absolutely critical. We need to learn to understand how to do this. But I also want to talk about something else that youth understands already that most of the rest of us don't. And I think it goes directly to this question that we've already raised of scarcity and indeed of intellectual property rights. Most of the young people I know don't observe an intellectual property rights regime at all. They're already fluent in a smooth and unbarricaded world of knowledge transfer. It's curious to me that the question of intellectual property arises, because I think you're absolutely correct that the world of knowledge is one that's inherently non-rivalrous. It's inherently non-exclusive. We are talking about an economy of abundance and not an economy of scarcity. What the youth already understands is how not to impose this artificial scarcity on knowledge. Youth doesn't observe these artificial distinctions. If they need to find something, if they need to download something, they'll find a way to do it. And I think that in this respect, it isn't simply that we need to inculcate the youth with values or how to understand critical thought and reflexivity. It's that we can take a page from what they're already doing. The culture of youth internationally, globally, is one of very, very few boundaries or barriers to the acquisition of information. I think they are already with not merely one foot, but both feet planted in a genuine knowledge economy where there's frictionless exchange of ideas. And I think that our economies can only benefit if we take a page from what they're trying to teach us.
Right, and he mentioned what you were saying, he, coming from the United States, he's worked a lot on, urban environments and that. Here, things differ, and I want to bring it back to the Arab world. So, soft skills and the importance of that for the future generation, and kind of shifting the paradigm with education, which comes back to the panel right before us. How do we move forward?
All right. I mean, start from the premise that knowledge can actually physically walk out the door, right? Knowledge is embedded in an individual rather than, it's a physical good. Once you realize that, then you start thinking about barriers to entry and exit within any one economy, any one market. And how do you actually create an ecosystem that promotes and values the knowledge and returns on knowledge? Look, today, going back also to economics, we think of countries as having, God-given comparative advantages in the production of certain goods and services. Well, the knowledge economy allows you actually to create your comparative advantages in certain areas. Bring that concept to the Arab world. What do we need? First, we need to marry the skills, of our kids and the students, to the demands of the labor market. And here we're not predicting anything. It's not about prediction. As I said, if you look at GM, the jobs are going from Detroit to Silicon Valley, right? So the car is going from, the tradition, or the value added is going from, a traditional car to a driverless car, right? So from a traditional way of doing things, from a work to a job. The nature of a job becomes what? It's like, the way I understand a 9-to-5 job, for the next generation, my guess is that they're going to be like experts, consultants, running on a part-time basis. They don't belong to any one organization. The earlier you embed that in your strategic planning for the education and skills development, the better are you prepared to actually
So we're talking about changing, shifting, if you don't want to say
Absolutely.
changing, the educational system.
My dear, you do not actually predict the future. You create the future. How do you create the future?
So
You start
optimistic.
today, right? You start today. And in the UAE, they began a decade ago. Look at the innovations, the UAE innovation strategy. Look at the UAE 2021 plan and Dubai 2021 plan, all of which actually have pillars that talk about not just the move away towards diversification, how to move in that direction, and achieve at the same time a transition to a knowledge-based economy. And it starts with education. If you look at the innovation strategy of the UAE, you have 7 sectors. Top of those sectors is education, followed by health, followed by water, followed by technology, transportation. All of these is like, best case examples and experience transferred here and creating the ecosystem. What is that ecosystem? It's the regulatory framework. The incentive structures that the governments actually provide for all those innovators, those creators. Going back to the idea that knowledge can literally walk out the door. You don't want them to walk out the door. You want them to use the door and come into your society, and therefore culture, environment, regulatory system have all to be one platform. And I see you nod your head.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, I find it interesting that we talk about, the future, and like you said, we create the future. And, one of the questions we get when we talk about knowledge economies and what to predict for the future and how we have to meet it is, how do we tie what we have learned traditionally with the new shifts in the paradigm? I'm opening this to any one of you, whoever wants to take this, because people, and I'll get back to this later, people keep thinking the human aspect with AI and with the advancement of digitalization is going to diminish. But some people and most critics and analysts argue it has never been more important to have the human aspect. But first, how do we tie the traditional and what's coming next?
Well, I think we run into problems when we treat knowledge as an abstraction, right? Because knowledge is 2 things. It's situated, it's the product of a particular human context and environment, and it's embodied. It is literally something that we engage and express through the organization of our physical selves embedded in a physical world. And when we think that knowledge is something that can be lifted up out of these contexts, read off these situations, abstracted, and turned into ones and zeros for transmission to a different place, a different context, a different environment, we run the risk of not understanding that knowledge in depth. Most knowledge in human organizations, most knowledge in human institutions, the thing that makes the world run, the thing that makes this event run, the thing that makes this conference center run, the thing that makes the city that the conference center is in run, is tacit knowledge. It's not explicit. It's something that we barely know how to account for or express, even when challenged to do so. So the idea that you could merely lift this knowledge up out of the arrangement of spaces, the arrangement of bodies, the arrangement of ourselves socially, and redeploy it somewhere else has always struck me as a fairly shallow understanding of the situation. I think the more we get into the idea that algorithmic systems will be responsible for producing the salient knowledge in the world, which is clearly where we're headed, we run a very great risk of thinking that it is only the explicit aspects of a circumstance that will inform the design of those algorithms and their development and their deployment, when so often the things that matter, the things that bind the world together and allow it to work, are normally not expressed. They're what Heidegger would have called ready to hand rather than present at hand. They're unexamined, they're unarticulated. And yet this is the 90% of the iceberg that's below the surface of the water.
Yeah, you please, yes. I
Can
saw you
just-
nodding.
Can I just carry on here? It just struck my mind that in fact, when we define an individual, we also think in terms of what tacit and of course new knowledge, intelligence, but of course the whole cognitive capacity, but the way how a person expresses and communicates one's sentiments, feelings and so on. And here I think that there is really no need to be afraid of the artificial intelligence. It is just another tool which will and can, if we properly behave, of course, and organize ourselves as society, will assist us to become even more human, to respect the principles of solidarity, social cohesion, and so on more. The foresight concerning the impact of artificial intelligence so far is rather positive. In fact, in future we will have a very high percentage of jobs who will be strictly addressing the health, medicine, elderly care, and of course servicing people in the community. And that will make our life even better than it is at the moment.
You can add to that.
Youmna,
I see you
listen.
thinking.
No, I was thinking because your question actually leads one to believe, and I don't want to leave any illusion in your minds, that to create a knowledge-based economy is the job of someone. Someone takes on the mantra and runs with it, and everyone follows. No, it is actually creating an incentive ecosystem, incentive compatible with the creation of a knowledge-based economy. So it does not fall upon me or you or all of us are responsible. Begin with a culture of knowledge, right? That's a critical element of it, right? The regulatory framework that the government institutes within an economy is a major pillar, right? I mean, they have to come together. Remember, I mean, I didn't use it as a punchline. Knowledge can walk out the door. You don't want it to walk out the door, and therefore you want to have all the incentive structure that is incentive compatible.
You keep saying that, but
yes,
why?
I keep saying it because
tell me why you keep saying that.
Because it is the critical element, and here, in the UAE.
And how do we keep it in the door?
Listen,
or in the room?
Exactly, right? So you have an open economy, open society. It is not just open to goods, services, and people. It's open for ideas. Right? So there are no restrictions, no barriers on exchange of ideas across border. And if that were to be the case, then, all knowledge will shift to where, these things are, or these things are. Today, you have virtual marketplaces. I can be here and working for a company, as an expert or consultant, what have you, somewhere in I don't know, in Timbuktu, right? So why am I here? I have to look at the entire, the hard and the soft infrastructure.
Because we don't want knowledge to walk out the door.
Absolutely not. And here I am. I walked into the door.
And we're happy you're with us. I stole nicely your PowerPoint presentation. I looked into it, and I have a few questions. Borrowed is not. Thank you for being so kind. No, it's interesting, and I think what I want to get to is, in one of your slides, if you will, you were talking about how the acceleration of innovations market penetration was seen with, the number of years it took to reach a global market of 50 million consumers. The telephone took 50 years to reach 50 million consumers. Twitter took 2. And it's interesting because we almost have this feeling that we can't keep up with what's coming. And that we need to scrapple. There's fear of what's next. There's how do we adapt us as, millennials, and how do we meet the challenges of tomorrow?
You call them challenges, I call them opportunities.
He's optimistic.
That's the
No, it's
same
not
thing,
that.
isn't it?
Yeah, no, but listen.
If we
man,
understand it the right way.
As the world was moving into electric cars and innovating and stuff, now we're talking about a driverless car.
How do we meet the opportunities of
right?
tomorrow?
Because
I
as
think
I
we have
said, don't predict, just try and create.
Create.
Jump into look at any product before you today, right? The values that are upstream and the values that are downstreams. These are the real values. In between parts and components, producing them, they're like, everyday's knowledge, everyday's techniques. But where does it come? Downstream is the marketing, after sales services and all this. Upstream is the design, the research, development. This is where you want to focus, and that's exactly the regulatory framework that is going.
How do we meet the I'm going to start using that instead of challenges. Just kind of change the wording. It makes a whole world of difference.
Yeah, I'm actually, as I'm listening to the conversation, I'm thinking about a book that a philosopher named Ivan Illich wrote in 1973, a book called Tools for Conviviality. And he has a very special and distinct definition of the word conviviality. When we say conviviality, ordinarily we mean the idea that we're going to meet friends and family over dinner, over drinks and food. What he means by conviviality is something very different. He says that a convivial technology is one that operates at human scale in terms of space and speed. A convivial technology is one that people can understand, that's self-authenticating, that it explains itself to them, that it can be reverse engineered, that you can tinker with it and it will explain itself to you. And finally, a convivial technology is one that organizes a human community around it. And when I think about artificial intelligence, when I think about machine learning, when I think about the algorithmic production of knowledge, which is something that I just gave a presentation on a little while ago, I think that these technologies are not very convivial. We don't understand them. They operate at spatial and temporal registers that are either beyond or beneath the human threshold of perception. We can't kind of open up the hood and tinker with them and learn how to use them. Most ordinary people will never understand them, and yet they intervene in the power relations of our world. They produce the circumstances that we're forced to contend with as individuals and societies. And what I think we need very much to do is understand that if we want to survive and we want our environment to be comprehensible to us and to have the values that we hold so dear to heart, we need to design a generation of convivial technologies. We need to ensure that the quote unquote, the ostensibly advanced technologies of algorithmic control, of machine learning, of deep learning, algorithmic knowledge production, these things need to be designed so as to be convivial by Illich's definition, or they will be nothing at all. Or the world that we will be forced to live in will operate at speeds and scales that we will never comprehend. Mm-hmm. It will be a permanently alienating environment in which there's no such thing as human texture, human value, human meaning. I think we need to be very, very careful about the ways in which we design and devise and deploy the next generation's technology. Mm-hmm. This is the critical threshold. If we do not do this now, then the matter and the energy of the world will be organized according to logics, by processes and at scales that we will simply not be able to relate to, and we will certainly not be able to apply our values to.
So there are certain fears and concerns.
Of course there are. Of course, as I said, the GM when it slashed 14,700 jobs earlier this week, at the same time that it was creating more jobs in Silicon Valley in its company called Cruise, right? I mean, they still need people, but it so happened that they're the wrong type of skills that the people that they just let go, right? So what are they doing now? They're investing in the non-traditional, 100 years, GM, 100 years they've been doing the same thing, innovating at the margins in, the combustible engine and stuff. And now they're going into, the driverless car technology and all this. And those who were able to actually invest in the skills and in their capacity to learn new things, they end up in Silicon Valley, from Detroit to Silicon Valley, and I hope, from Silicon Valley to Dubai or to Abu Dhabi.
Okay. I want to talk about
May
scales.
I join here?
Go ahead. Yes, yes, please. Go ahead.
There is a big difference between countries where governments are aware of these rapid trends and are going in the right direction. I remember yesterday one of our participants comes from Luxembourg. He was explaining how the Luxembourgish government is offering to companies to retrain on the spot their staff to prepare them for the next step, which I find very, very interesting. And of course, you mentioned before the future. We have, of course, in this region and in Dubai in particular, of course, the government is simply obsessed with the future, anticipating what is going to happen and preparing things the right way. Korea, which was mentioned several times before as well, I think even 10 years ago they had created a ministry for planning the future.
Yeah, and you know, the UAE remains the first country that has created a ministry for artificial
Happiness.
intelligence,
Yes,
right? So there is the awareness. And what is that awareness? What is the objective behind this? Is to create the culture that will incentivize knowledge and the transition.
Yeah, and I
to
think
knowledge.
this word culture is just important because, and I really like, because you're very, very good with your terminology. And I think
I'm
it's,
specific.
yes, you are. But it's just interesting because you can view two things in different ways, right? And it's about how you approach it. Dr. Boris, you know, as I was reading a little bit before and we were talking about how, you know, the key achievements of knowledge economies and the fact that it's still very young. And we talked about the market-driven entrepreneurship being a dominant model that is transitioning well, and we see a lot of that growing. What is your take on that?
Well, I have to come back to the curricula of most universities around the globe nowadays. They still pretend as if entrepreneurship is a very rare gift of very few people, which is completely wrong. We have foresight data that the percentage of self-employed people will dramatically increase. And of course, that means that during the even formal education, we should teach kids. I am coming back to my friend's most frequent terminology, culture. Entrepreneurial culture
Yes.
should be installed into the curricula. And of course, at the same time, when we do it, we should do it in the right way. That means socially responsible entrepreneurship. Because the world is suffering because of tycoons who have the power and the possibility to make tremendous profits on the clients or consumers' account. That is not ethical, and of course that is not socially responsible. But if children from the early age would be familiarized, would develop a culture of responsible entrepreneurship, then of course we would have a much smoother way towards knowledge economy.
I like that he said
Excellent
CSR.
idea.
You didn't mention CSR or just social
I will
responsibility.
mention it if you will. You know.
The floor is yours. And then Adam, I want your take on this too.
Oh.
Just smiling and nodding.
You know, I don't like entrepreneurialism very much. I think it makes me sad.
The word
Why?
has been
The
overused.
concept, I think we need to be very careful about how we understand it. If you mean simply a stance towards the world that is sort of always scanning the horizon for opportunities and for the potential to make connections and to build on those connections, I think that's inherently creative. I think it's part of what
Yes.
makes us human. I think it's beautiful. I think the way entrepreneurship is understood mostly is very narrow. I think you know, the idea that everybody should have to start up a company, the idea that everybody should have to code, the idea that everybody should have to channel that creativity into one very narrow set of expressions, I find that tragic.
That's
It is.
misinterpretation, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I do definitely take your point that the world is suffering from the tycoons, from the oligarchs, but the world isn't simply suffering from that, it's suffering from the propagation, the hegemonic propagation, all the way down to the early childhood education level, that very narrow definition of entrepreneurship is somehow valuable. I find that shallow, and I find it saddening. I really do want to emphasize that these cultures, you know, these are particular positions which are of relatively recent origin. They've been propagated very widely. They're very useful for certain contexts and for certain sets of values, but they're not universal. They're merely selections from a far wider array of values that we could choose from. There are other values that have to do with balance or justice or beauty that don't speak to this fanatic need to optimize every situation that we find in the entrepreneurship literature. And I think if we're going to talk about culture and knowledge, we cannot collapse these things merely to the propensity to start up economically salient organizations. There's so much more that we need, that we mean
Right,
by...
so what would you add to that? So, you know, just so I understand, what would you add to that? Because you mentioned how shallow it can be, and is it shallow also, or you find it limited in the way that we express its definition?
Yeah, I think its shallowness limits us. I think we begin to understand creativity as merely that which can be economically valued. But the things which bring meaning and texture to our life are almost never economically valuable. They are, again, the convivial moments. They're moments at human scale. They're moments that we spend with the people that we love. They're moments that we spend in contemplation of nature. They're moments that we spend in contemplation of the absolute. These things cannot be valued economically. They're trans-material. They're not, they're just not accounted for, literally accounted for in that kind of way of seeing the world. And so I think that we're greater than that, we're larger than that, and we're better than that. And that is something that anytime we're discussing knowledge and culture, if we don't start from an understanding that we're more than simply startups and enterprises and opportunities, I think we're leaving something very, very important to the human equation out of the discussion.
Dr. Safadi, you want to add to that as the Chief Economic Advisor?
Well, I want something measurable and tangible in my hands to be able to actually come up with policies. I hear you. I hear you very loud and clear. Now, if you believe that knowledge actually is the one that will be adding value to any product or service moving ahead, right? As it has been throughout. You call it technology and, you know, technical skills, whatever, right? Then you realize its value within a value chain of a good or service. And automatically you deduce that it will determine the rate of return on investment. The way you're going to exploit knowledge, whether you create it or you use it, will determine the rate of investment on your project. And therefore, I am competing with other projects, not just within my marketplace, but across my borders. Until such a time when I get a better life index that the OECD has come up with, that measures all these attributes, valuable as they are, and translate them into rates of return on investment or investment even in education and in knowledge creation. See? Then I revert back to my traditional way, right? But make no mistake about it. People at my age, what they need to do today, I mean, it's a lifelong learning. We continue the lifelong learning, but now I become smarter, maybe. I don't know. You have to judge, right? But what I do, if I have a bright idea, right, I go talk to an engineer maybe and an IT person. So I'm an economist talking to someone who's, you know, bright in engineering stuff, and an IT guy or a lady who actually can translate this into the digital world.
Talent.
Absolutely.
Picking the
Thank you
talent.
very much. She stole the word out of my mouth. Thank you very much.
So
That's what it is.
And
So
I think-
none of us it becomes redundant. Lifelong learning, that's what it is. And investing in oneself. And I will find, you know, I have found, in fact, someone who's going to translate some of my ideas Maybe some of them are
Well, keep
time has
keep us
passed on them.
updated on that. We want to know what
Absolutely, I'll
happens. I
keep you
think
up-
everybody.
you know,
Please, Dr. Boris,
maybe
please
I'll
add
become
to it.
expensive.
Please.
Just another step. Historically, we are witnessing the first situation where 4 generations are living simultaneously. And at the same time, the speed of change is unprecedented. So this by itself, of course, opens many challenges. But we have to make ourselves ready to answer to these challenges. And I'm referring
Opportunities.
very practically, very practically. I think that the value of entrepreneurship, Adam, I would not like to define it narrowly. Entrepreneurship for me is a proactive, creative attitude. Somebody can be entrepreneur but doesn't have to open a company. You can be entrepreneurial in somebody else's company. You can be entrepreneurial in a non-government organization. You can be entrepreneurial in an effort within your own family. It is a quality which I think we cannot do without. And it has to be part of culture, as it was already mentioned.
It's in our genes in this,
Absolutely,
in this region.
absolutely. But what I want to say in one, 2 or sentences is having 4 living generations at the same time
I like this.
opens opportunities. We could learn. I mean, I'm 70 and something. I could learn, and I do learn from my daughter. Of course, when I teach something my grandson, and I see that he is proud to show that he has learned something, I feel happy as well. So we share this human feelings of being beneficial to each other. But of course, that requires that we really appreciate the benefits of sharing our lives together. While, as we know, unfortunately, there was a wave which, with poor economic conditions in a number of European countries, have some kind of condemned young people to stay together with parents. That is not the happiest situation if it is out of must, out of economic necessity. Or if you have, in some cultures, children by tradition are responsible to maintain their parents, which again is something that you have to do, not because you want to. So if that can be overcome, then of course this intergenerational cohabitation and collaboration can be an answer to many questions.
Are we a little bit happier with that definition now, or the way we perceive it? You can, please.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that if we understand, the reason I don't use the word entrepreneurialism is because it does so easily get collapsed to this very narrow identity. I think that as you move across cultures, obviously all of the nuance gets bled out of one's communication. We use sort of an international pidgin or an international jargon that tends to reduce shades of meaning. And as a result, I think all of the beautiful things that you refer to, all of the deeply human propensities towards creativity and towards the combinatorial explosion of opportunity in the mind of a young person as they perceive the world, I think all of that sort of gets shaded out. If we agree that that is in fact what we're talking about, yes, absolutely, it is one of the things which makes us human, and it should be encouraged. I find that our societies, other than the obligatory contexts that you're talking about, which are driven by economic hardship, we don't often have opportunities for intergenerational knowledge transfer. We don't often have opportunities to meet cross generations casually and on open terms. I think everybody's very armored and very defended. We tend to not understand. Age and generation are a culture, just as national cultures are. So when we're speaking, if you're in your 20s and you're speaking to somebody in your 70s, if you're in your 50s and speaking to somebody in your 30s, these are cultural boundaries that you're communicating across. And we barely have the tools to do that. It takes a lot of time and energy to create the context in which people are able to meet and to converse and to share ideas and to share knowledge and to share values in ways that aren't barricaded. So I think that the more time and energy we can devote to creating those spaces, the better. I think in particular there is a generation of knowledge that was produced between, I'll say, about 1965 and 1975, which is absolutely critical, literally critical to the survival of the human species, that in our headlong rush to meet the future, we've sort of folded over and forgotten about. There were books like The Limits to Growth, like Small is Beautiful. There were books like Silent Spring. Again, Tools for Conviviality, Deschooling Society. Extraordinarily important ideas for the maintenance of human value over time that we somehow have forgotten and disregarded. To the extent that that knowledge came to reside in people who are now in their 60s and 70s and 80s, we desperately need to recover that knowledge. I say that as a person who's a good bit younger than that, but not for very much longer. And I think that people who are your age or even younger, these are not trendy books. These are not trendy ideas.
Yeah.
But we desperately, desperately need to disinter them, to dig them back up, to discover the wisdom that's embedded in them, because that is how we're going to survive together.
And I think what we before we conclude, I want to open the floor to a few questions from the audience, if there are any. But, what I hear is that inclusivity, diversity, talent, soft skills, this is what I'm hearing from all of you, the increasing gap between the market demands and the available people is a fantastic opportunity to upscale what we have today towards the jobs of the future. Are there any questions from our audiences?
Hi, my name's Yasmin, and I'm studying environmental science at New York University in New York. So this, speaking about the youth and I'm 21 years old, so I'm a millennial, and I just came to realize, being here, that although we're talking a lot about the future and what my generation is going to do, I feel a sense of pessimism among my generation, and speaking a lot about our future, I'm afraid for my future, because every day, I open the news, I read about how we're depleting our natural resources. My kids, I don't even know if I'll be able to get old and live the life my parents currently live, It's a scary time for me, so I just wonder about how your generation plans to create a sense of optimism for us, because many of us are honestly really afraid. And speaking about jobs and entrepreneurship, for example, I'm afraid to graduate and not be able to find a job, especially when we're talking about things like AI taking over and people like me not even, having access to any jobs, despite me having so much knowledge and so much to say. I am afraid, so I'm wondering how you plan to address this.
Wow, that's a good
awesome.
question. Wow, thank you for that. And let me just say one thing, and then I'll open it to you.
Okay.
Being 21, just going through that is perfectly normal. Now I'm going to let these gentlemen tell you how they plan to address it, but generally, being in this unknown and confusion state is usually something we go to at 21.
For sure.
But how do you plan to address that?
I'll be happy to start. A few months ago, I attended a conference organized by Organization of Students in Slovenia, and it was organized at the Ministry of Education. I was utterly disappointed by the very passive attitude of the student representatives. Instead of being assertive and demanding and critical, they were accommodating and saying, well, there are problems and we hope that they will be resolved. My intervention there was, I said, do you know who brings change in history? Young people, with pressure. And this is part of my response. You have to express loud and clear and in a determined way to the people responsible for various areas of policies, because unless you do it, they will do less.
Yes.
So pressure is definitely one thing. And second, we are living in a time when you can communicate your opinion to the governments, to the authorities, to
It's called Twitter.
leadership of organizations much more than ever before.
Yeah.
And that is not being used enough. I'm a member of a Avas group in Canada. They send around information about a problematic case. That was, for example, in Iceland, which allowed a tycoon to kill whales and make money out of it. In 10 days, 150,000 petitions have been signed, and the Icelandic government has prohibited that. It means it can be done, but you have to be active.
Please.
Yeah, Yasmin, where are you? Hey, first let me say that that was an extraordinarily brave comment and question. So I'm really grateful that you brought that to the table. I think you're right. I mean, I'm scared too. I think that my generation blew it in in the moral obligation that we had to resist. We were mostly complacent. We were mostly happy with what the consumer society brought us. I don't speak personally. I spent quite a lot of energy resisting. But I think generationally we blew it, and we squandered 20 or 30 years in which we could have made a difference. I think you're absolutely right to be afraid about having children. I don't have children myself. I think that you're absolutely right to be afraid of not having a job. I don't believe that jobs will exist in your professional lifetime. And I think that what you will need to do, unfortunately, is we're asking a lot of you, is to develop the resilience and the independence and the self-containment to be able to adapt to radically changing circumstances in a very short amount of time in a way that might impact very harshly on your comfort and on the standard of living that you expect to be able to enjoy. I think that all of us are frankly going to have to get used to a world in which we have less than we have now. And I think that the more resilient you can be to that, it's not fair to ask you to have to shoulder that responsibility. It's not fair at all. But just practically speaking and putting the ethics of it to the side, I think that the tougher you are, the more self-contained you are, and the less that you need from the world, the more effective and the happier you'll be. Now that is pretty, I'm not sugarcoating anything, but you were very brave and very forthright in your question, and I feel like I owe it to you to be at least as honest in my answer. So I hope that's a reasonable answer for you.
Dr. Safadi, how do we appease concerns of the new generation? Because, with the depleting resources, and she's right about the fact that, it's kind of a struggle now to find, it's always been a struggle, but more so now we feel because of what's happening with our world.
I feel your anxiety. Youmna said, when I was your age, I had the same anxiety. Who am I? What am I going to do? And I have a Cartesian mind, so let me try and appease you in a Cartesian way. I'd like to think that the world that I'm going to pass to my children is a better world than my father gave to me when he passed away. And that's the nature of progress. Certainly it comes with its positives as well as negatives. The jobs of the future. Don't believe anyone who would pretend to tell you to predict the future. As I said, we do not predict, we cannot predict, we can create a future. And what is now being created before our hands, before our own eyes? A world that, you say, on the environmental front, you've done really bad, you score bad. Then you tell me on societal front, Raed, you score bad, right? So on these two fronts, the world that I'm giving back to my children is not, better than the world that I took from my father. So, don't depend on me for change. I'm yesterday's news. You change the things.
We are unfortunately out of time, but I will invite you all to come up to our panelists afterwards and ask them any questions you want. Feel free to...
There's a guy over there. He's anxious to ask a question.
Come on, yeah, I think we
I
can do
know
one
we
more.
have, I don't know how they are with time. Do you want to ask a quick
Let's do
one?
one- let's do one
a quick
more,
one?
come on.
All right.
Quick one.
I'm Narayana, working for a consultancy company in energy, environment, health and safety, waste management in Dubai. I'm the winner of Emirates Energy Engineer, best practices in environmental projects, best practices in environmental application sustainability, best wastewater design, wastewater treatment design, and many, many awards I got. But as honorable professors and speakers were exactly telling, many people are having a lot of ideas. They are not able to implement.
You got to
So
speak
I
into the mic, man.
I have a lot of ideas, but the main problem, what I feel, finance is being supported and having the policies and procedures. Government supports most of the finance. Similarly, many people are having knowledge, ideas, technology, but they don't have support from the policies and procedures. Maybe because I'm the person who has done the best air quality management study to Dubai, where I recommended so many 39 recommendations. Out of that, most of the recommendations are implemented by Dubai government. One of that is metro, recommended by me, roads and bridges, signal-free
Sir,
traffic.
I'm sorry, what is your question? Just because we're out of time. Do you have a question specific to one of our panelists? Because
Yeah, my question is, we need to have support for technology
That's not a question.
and knowledge, especially in the knowledge, as per the knowledge summit,
I'll answer
from
you,
the
my friend.
governmental and organizations.
All
I
right.
have plenty of ideas, but some of the ideas are beautiful: energy saving, environmental improvement, health and safety. I can improve the health and safety of the people.
Dr. Safadi.
I am ready. Look, I'll give you my email. Send me those beautiful ideas you talked about.
I have so
right?
many.
I assure you. Now, one thing for sure, and when you say in Dubai, look at the physical infrastructure that is available in Dubai is second to none in terms of your connectivity, whether on the digital front or on the physical front. Look at the soft infrastructure in terms of the regulatory framework that is conducive to actually, receiving your ideas, and if they're worthwhile, if they fall within the strategic orientation of the government, they will be implemented with a blink of an eye, my friend. Nowhere else in the world where you have access and partnership with a leadership that responds to opportunities if they are actually in line with the strategic orientation.
And on that note, we thank you all. Thank you so much for attending this. Thank you to Dr. Raed, Dr. Boris, and Adam for being here. Knowledge Economy for Future Cities, and thank you all for attending. Thank you.